Okay, hi everybody. My name is Carol Glasser, and I am a member of the American Sociological Association's Animal and Society section, and we are very proudly one of the co-sponsors, along with the Animals and Society Institute, of this colloquium series, which is called the Animals and Society Colloquium Series. We have an event about once a month during the academic year. This one is kicking off our spring semester events. We're going to have another event in February, but the date and title is not quite pinned down yet. So make sure whatever email listserv you are on to get information about this, you're checking on it, because probably in a week or two, you'll hear about our next event. But let's get to today's event. I'm going to turn this over to Liz Herkey to tell you a little bit about ASI and today's event, and then we will get started with our panel. Right before I do that, please know that we do have a Q&A, so this is a panel session, and I will moderate the question and answer. I won't be talking during this event. I'll be off screen, but I'll be moderating questions and helping out with questions. So feel free to use the chat. Feel free to use the questions that will be good to ask at the end. I'll push over and save towards the end. And feel free to keep the chat active along with one another. So with that, I'll hand things over to Liz.
Thanks, Carol, and hello to everyone, and welcome again to today's colloquium. We have a distinguished panel of speakers, but as Carol mentioned, before we jump into the program, I just want to tell you a little bit more about the series in case this is your first time joining us. But first and foremost, I do want to give a big thank you to Carol Glasser for coming up with the idea of this colloquium series. And this is a joint project between the Animals and Society section of the American Sociological Association and the Animals and Society Institute. Now, if you're a sociologist and you have not already, we hope that you will consider joining the ASA and, of course, joining the Animals and Society section. For those of you who are not familiar with the Animals and Society Institute, ASI is dedicated to furthering the field of human-animal studies as it concerns the complex relationship between humans and other animals. And in some form or another, ASI has been around for the last 40 years. Many of our programs and activities include 2 managed academic journals, a book series on human-animal studies, our Defining HAS video series, which you can find on YouTube, and loads of resources for scholars, researchers, faculty, mental health, and other professionals. We have an ASI newsletter, as well as our Human Animal Studies report, the HAS report. These resources and many can be found on our website, including a database of HAS-related academic programs. Don't worry about trying to find these on your own. We're going to put links to these resources in the chat for you. And we encourage everyone, non-academics or academics of any discipline, to sign up for the HAS report. Although it's currently on sabbatical, you can find past issues on the website, and it's a valuable resource, and we hope that you'll check it out, including all of our other resources. So on to today's talk. Without further ado, I am very pleased to turn over the microphone to the moderator of today's panel, Dr. Katja Guenther, professor in the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies, University of California, Riverside, who will tell you more about herself and introduce our distinguished panelists. Dr. Guenther?
Thank you so much, Liz and Carol, and everyone for joining us today. Before we begin, I'd just like to respectfully acknowledge that I join you from the unceded lands of the Hmonga people, whose Spanish settlers began colonizing here in what is now called Pasadena, California, starting in the late 18th century, and whose history and current contributions remain very vital to my community. I extend my gratitude and respect. I also would like to thank our hosts today, the Animals and Society Institute and the ASA section on Animals and Society, and especially Gala Argent, Lisa Burnell, Liz Herkey, and Carol Glasser for your labor in coordinating this. Thank you so much for having us. I'm joining you today as one of the co-editors of the anthology When Animals Die, Examining Justifications and Envisioning Justice. I think it's fair to say that life, death, and renewal tend to be front of mind for me at all times, but they're particularly so right now in the last few weeks, because I live in the burn zone of the devastating Eaton fire, in which so many homes, both for humans and other species, and lives were lost. And at least here locally, I don't know how much of this is being transmitted through the national news, we've learned a great deal about the human victims of the fire. We're seeing detailed profiles of the victims and their families, the circumstances of their deaths, their interests, and their contributions to the community. And of course, that is very much appreciated, and we honor and mourn them. We're not really hearing so much about the animals who have been lost in this fire, including Starlight the pony, Staunton the pit bull, hundreds of animals who are popping up daily on my social media feeds as still being missing and are presumed dead, but we don't yet have confirmation. And so far, and it's now been over 2 weeks since the fire, I literally haven't heard one mention in the news media of any kind about free roaming or so-called wild animals who were displaced. I did see one television journalist on the news when a deer ran past during the actual active period of the fire. So that's literally been the only the only experience that I've had so far, and I've been following the news about this quite closely, in which wild or free roaming animals have been acknowledged as being part of this experience and this tragedy, and of course as creatures who have lost, in terms of space, the greatest amount of their home. So these, of course, bring up a lot of key themes from the anthology: when animals die, questions about whose lives and deaths we as humans pay attention to, and how we justify some deaths as inevitable and others that we see as tragic and unnecessary losses. My co-editor, Julian Keenan, and I were really motivated to coordinate the anthology because of our interest in how animals and humans recognize, make sense of, and resist animal death. And I'm so happy to be here today with 3 contributors to the volume to talk a bit about their work. Because our time together today is limited, I want to keep introductions to a minimum without minimizing the works of these scholars. So I'm just going to be introducing them verbally very briefly, and then I'll be placing technology on my end permitting links to profiles with more information about them into the chat. So those of you who'd like to read more about their work have an easy way to access that. Professor Charlotte Coté joins us as Professor of American Indian Studies at the University of Washington in Seattle. Her most recent book is A Drum in One Hand, a Sockeye in the Other: Stories of Indigenous Food Sovereignty from the Northwest Coast. And Charlotte unexpectedly needs to leave a bit early today, so we're going to be prioritizing her contributions to our conversation and having her go first in response to questions initially. Lisa Jean Moore is SUNY Distinguished Professor of Sociology and Women's Studies at Purchase College. Her most recent book is Our Transgenic Future: Spider Goats, Genetic Modification, and the Will to Change Nature. And finally, David Pellow is Dalison Chair and Professor of Environmental Studies and Director of the Global Environmental Justice Project at the University of California in Santa Barbara, who's published extensively on environmental and social justice, including animal liberation. I asked Charlotte, Lisa Jean, and David to be part of this panel because their contributions to the volume When Animals Die, I think, really wonderfully illustrate the diversity of how we can go about conceptualizing and investigating issues of animal death from a range of perspectives. I think everyone is probably eager to hear from our panelists, so I'm going to start by simply asking our panelists if each of them could share what they see as the key takeaways from their chapters and contributions to When Animals Die in about 3 sentences. And we will start with Charlotte.
Pleco, thank you. And I also want to acknowledge that I am not in my traditional territory, New Channel's territory on west coast of Vancouver Island. I'm from the Tseshat Nation, but I am residing in the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples. I really thought about this and with respect to all the chapters and what the contributions that were made and these amazing writers that compiled this very important book. The chapters really helped me understand how complex animal life is and animal death is, and provided me with a richer and broader understanding of animal death from many different perspectives. So that really is my main takeaway.
Thank you. Lisa Jean, would you like to comment next?
Sure. Thank you so much for asking me to participate in this panel. And I maybe misunderstood, but I thought I was supposed to give you 3 sentences of what my chapter was about. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, that would be
So
great.
basically, I talk about how spider gopes represent a uniquely 21st century phenomenon. We've manufactured and created an extinction event in the span of just 3 decades, driven not by climate change, but by capitalism's relentless pursuit of cheaper and more efficient production methods. So spider gulls are transgenic animals that are living factories, and they were inscribed with their obsolescence right from the beginning because their worth is measured in the grams of protein they produce from spider silk that comes out when they lactate. So my chapter is about how we continue to create these new life forms to serve human needs, but we also then don't really have a lot of analysis about the responsibilities we have to species that we've brought into existence when they're no longer economically viable for us.
Great, thank you. And David.
Yes, can you hear me okay? Great. Thanks so much, Katja, for having us. And I'm bringing you greetings from unceded ancestral Chumash land, also known as Santa Barbara, California. My chapter argues for the importance of focusing on multi-species violence within the prison industrial complex, and I do so across 4 terrains. One is looking at the impact of carceral systems on non-human animal well-being and habitat, which regularly results in the degradation of their ecosystems and the physical death of those animals. Second, the consumption of non-human animals by incarcerated persons through the daily food service operations that we see in carceral facilities. Third is the killing of non-humans through the use of imprisoned human beings as farm and slaughterhouse laborers. And fourth, the sedimented violence associated with some prisons being located atop former industrial scale animal killing facilities. So the point there, the key takeaway is that certainly while the overwhelming majority of scholarship on violence, pain, and suffering within the prison industrial complex focuses on humans, which is certainly important, the violence directed at non-human animals is considerable and requires our attention.
Thank you. And I hope that just these brief introductory comments from the authors about their chapters give you some ideas already about the diverse ways that they're approaching or thinking about animal death, engaging with different types of discourses, whether food sovereignty or engaging more, as Lisa Jean's case, with scientific justifications and profit-based justifications for the utilization of animal bodies and animal deaths. And then David's engagement with carceral institutions and thinking as well about environmental justice issues and their intersections with race, class, and gender. For all of you, your chapters for the book When Animals Die are part of larger projects, in some cases book projects, or even, I think it's fair to say, like career spanning projects that may address in different ways animal death, but don't necessarily focus entirely on animal death. I'm interested to hear what centering animal death in these chapters brought up for you as you were working on developing your chapter, and articulating what it was that you wanted to share about animal death and the context of human-animal relations. Charlotte, can we start with you again? Because you may still be here when we finish with this question, but possibly not.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to share. So I want to speak to this, to what I covered in this chapter, because I have written about this topic. It wasn't new to me. Not so much when animals die, but the topic of animals giving themselves as physical forms to humans as food. That's central to the work that I do. It was part of a book I wrote on Makah Nuu-chah-nulth whaling tradition in 2010, focusing on the issues, especially legal issues that came about because of the Makah and my people wanting to bring whale back into our diets. And so I really think about it, made me think about it in a different way, having it within this context of when animals die, and how this idea of animals giving themselves is really central to relationships based on reciprocity and respect that Indigenous peoples have to our non-human relatives, whether they are animals or plants. So for some people, this concept of taking animals for food is very difficult to understand. And I write about that in this chapter. For when I talked about Makah and Nuu-chah-nulth whaling, I mean, we have to go back to understanding how central whaling was to our cultures for thousands of years, and that we lived alongside whales and had a relationship with them, one that was sacred, one that was respectful. But deep inside our cultures, we have a belief and understanding that killing animals for substance is necessary and acceptable, necessary to our very survival. We have this understanding that we are part of a natural world, and predation is part of that world. It's integral to the world we live in. Indigenous people see their relationship with the environment as mutually interdependent. And one of the most important teachings, I think a teaching which I discuss in that chapter as well, being raised in this tradition, born and raised in my native community, it's that everything is interconnected, that we have this understanding of philosophy in our worldview, Tseshat worldview, called Hachatakmat Tsawak, also known as Hishokish Tsawak, really meaning that everything around you is connected in some way, in a very sacred way. So significant to the obligations that we Nuu-chah-nulth or Nuu-chah-nulth peoples have to our non-human relations, to those relatives, is that we have strict protocols and rituals around taking animals for food. These protocols and rituals are grounded in our philosophies of Isak literally translating to respect or being respectful, and also U'ahluk, which translates to taking care or being in care, taking care of. And it really is, the justification of those rituals stems from our belief that animals have spirits, just like human beings. And so the taking of an animal's life is intertwined with all our spiritual beliefs and the obligations that go with that. So in our belief system, when ceremonies and protocols are conducted within this framework of respect and care, the animal then chooses itself and offers its physical body to us as food. It's something that still many people don't understand. And so I was really happy to be part of this wonderful volume that looked at death and animal death in many different ways, because there's so much misunderstanding around that. So, in my culture, emphasis is placed on the importance of having these respectful relationships excuse me, our non-human relatives, with animals, with plants. It's essential for connecting our spirits, maintaining a very respectful relationship, so they'll continue to sacrifice their human forms to us, their physical forms to us as food. If proper respect and protocols aren't observed, then this fractures those sacred relationships. And they wouldn't allow themselves to be caught. They wouldn't allow themselves, there wouldn't be that relationship. It would be torn apart. So embedded within our philosophies, within Indigenous eco-philosophy and worldview, is the cultural knowledge and understanding that plants, animals, land, water, air, everything around us is interconnected in a web of life, emphasizing these relationships of gratitude and respect. And so I just want to end by saying that I wanted to share in this chapter that in our cultures and Indigenous cultures, we have this understanding that we exist as humans, animals, plants in a shared environment. We don't see a hierarchy within our worldview, that we are all equal, that our cultures thrive for thousands of years in a world of reciprocity, and that our relationships with animals has always been one of gratitude and respect. And within that symbiotic relationship was the understanding that death is ultimately integrated into life. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. And I think that it will be very apparent how markedly different the worldview that you were talking about is from those that Lisa Jean and David are engaging with in Western scientific and carceral discourses about human-animal relations. And literally every dimension, I think, of what you were just talking about. Whether non-hierarchical, interrelated, symbiotic, right? So much of that missing from the dominant white Western framework for thinking about human-animal relations and human access to animal lives, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Lisa Jean, what did centering animal death in your chapter bring up for you, thinking about the transgenic spider goats? I see a slide from you, Lisa Jean, but I'm not hearing you. I'm not sure if you are.
You're muted, Lisa Jean.
Oh, there we go. Thank you.
There we go. Sorry about that. Yeah, so I just wanted to share a couple slides just to show the animals, and then I'll answer the questions. So this will just take a minute. So the research was conducted for a few years at Utah State University at the Animal Science Farm. And these are the spider goats. They look like normal goats. Some of them are non-transgenic and some of them are transgenic. The transgenic ones are marked with an X and the non-transgenic ones are not. And the reason they're both together is that the non-transgenic goats are the ones that serve as milk for the babies that are born, because the goats are kept in the constant state of being pregnant and freshened and being repregnated to get to the valuable spider transgenic milk. What that means is that what happened was in the 1990s, there was a Department of Defense call for proposals to create a transgenic model to produce spider silk as a flexible and strong product to be used by the Department of Defense in the case of bulletproof vests and items such as that. Purification began at the University of Wyoming in 2003. The peak research happened a little over 8 or 9 years ago, and then the transition and the shift to cardiac research is what has most recently happened. This is the spider that's called a golden orb weaver spider that is used. The DNA of the spider was used to produce the transgenic goat. Here's a goat getting milked. Here's buckets of transgenic goat milk that's going to be purified. Here's the purification system. I know it looks like insane, but that's what it looks like. It's very loud, and it produces this powder form, which is the spider silk protein, which then goes on to produce a bulletproof type fabric / putty that you can put on things, bandages that can be used with humans because they're antimicrobial and antibacterial, or if you're Adidas, a kind of knockoff sneaker that can be used for, I guess, your kind of concept store and somewhere in Manhattan. Okay, so I just wanted to share that with you so that you had a sense of what I was talking about when I'm talking about spider silk and what the goats are. I think for me, working on this chapter really helped me to understand Lauren Berland's concept of a slow death, which describes not a dramatic ending, but rather a gradual wearing down of through the mundane demands of capital, where populations are slowly depleted by this daily grind of economic pressure and demands. So in the case of the spider goats, what ends up happening is their gradual obsolescence is manifested in each generation because they become less productive at producing spider silk protein, and other mechanisms to produce the protein sort of eclipse them. So their value as animals and as living factories steadily diminishes through a spreadsheet of protein yields versus maintenance costs until they're deemed too inefficient and too expensive. Unlike farm animals who might face immediate slaughter, spider goats experience a sort of drawn out process of devaluation where their transgenic bodies have an expiry date that is measured in grams of protein that they produce. And so what ended up happening with the spider goats is once they were no longer deemed valuable to produce the protein, they were given to other researchers for cardiac research, where they were used as surrogate goats to produce other goats that could then be used for cardiac research at that South Farm in Utah. So much so that in my final interview with the people in the spider silk lab, they really had lost track of where the spider goats were in the research process. So we no longer take care of or manage spider silk spider goats. And my questions and my area of interest is about not only understanding what slow death is for animals, but also understanding what are our responsibilities to a species that we've created. And we've created for a very specific purpose, and then let go extinct in this very slow, gruesome, painful way through generational death. So that's basically what I was interested in sort of exploring in the chapter. And from my book, this chapter gave me the opportunity to sort of have a coda to this population of animals that I had spent 3 years with. So I was really grateful for that.
Thank you for that, Lisa Jean. And it's interesting to me the ways in which so many of the contributions to this book engage with death, but uncover different types of deaths, right? You're talking about slow death. I know David in his chapter, and maybe he'll mention this, bring this in now or not, that's okay too, about social death, right? There are many different ways of conceptualizing the process of how life, and in some cases even in entire species like spider goats, right, lives come to an end.
Mm-hmm.
David, how about you? How did thinking about death, focusing on that death in this chapter, offer some new opportunities for you or bring up new angles?
Yeah, I appreciate the question, and I may be far less eloquent than my colleagues here, but I would say yeah, centering on animal death for me is hugely important as somebody who is primarily an environmental sociologist, an environmental justice scholar, and I've had to reckon with the fact, and I still am reckoning with the fact that, the field of environmental justice studies and the environmental justice movement have largely, if not entirely, overlooked this matter of animal death, non-human animal death. And so for me, it's a huge deficit in a field and in a movement that really prides itself on addressing deficits and getting people to acknowledge those deficits and to focus on justice. So that's really big for me. And so I would say relatedly, since the social category of the non-human is always defined in relation to and against the human, And since many marginalized humans are racialized and gendered in ways that place them closer to non-human life and nature, and since non-human life and nature are generally devalued in Western context, Charlotte, of course, provided a very important exception to that. This means I need to figure out a way to address both the animal deficit in environmental justice scholarship and politics, and grapple with the fact, or grapple with and center the fact that many marginalized communities are facing environmental injustices, in large part because they are treated by nation states, by corporations, by dominant institutions and dominant cultures as subhuman. And the trick, of course, for me is to do that in a way that doesn't reinforce racism or anti-indigeneity or speciesism. And so for me, this presents an opportunity for more deeply intersectional thinking and action that can embrace multi-species justice, and I think environmental justice has to be part of that work. And finally, I'll just say, and Katja, you reminded me of this earlier with your really important comment about the wildfires and SoCal. But when we center animal death in this kind of work, we find more often than not that the degree and intensity of that suffering and oppression facing non-humans is enormous by comparison to human oppression. I hate to play the oppression Olympics, but that's just a fact, and the wildfires are a really good example of that.
Thank you. I appreciate the thoughtfulness of all of your comments, and I can hear that that death is perhaps more front of mind in all of our work than I had realized. It is hard to separate out when we're talking about oppression, when we're talking and examining issues of violence, any aspect of human-animal relations, tend to be marked by these, particularly in Western cultures. Great. So I see that we're already at 11:34 on my clock, and I know we had promised to leave ample time for question and answer. So Dave and Lisa Jean, if there's anything else that you would like to offer at this point, you're absolutely welcome to. And otherwise, we can open up to questions from our participants that you may have for the panelists. Charlotte unfortunately did have to depart for health reasons, but Dave and Lisa Jean are here, and I'm happy to speak as well about any questions pertaining to the volume, maybe as a whole.
We can start with a question that is already in the Q&A forum, which asks, and I'm not sure who best, I think everybody might have something different to say about this, but is it possible for animals to quote unquote give themselves to humans? How do humans know they consent? And this question came up during the first question you all were asking, I think perhaps while Lisa Jean was talking. So is it possible for animals, I'm guessing non-human animals, to give themselves to humans?
Lisa Jean, are you interested in responding?
I don't know if I
Oh, it
don't
might have
know.
been when Charlotte was talking,
I don't think I
actually.
said,
Yeah,
I don't think I said that because it doesn't
So, yeah, so
to me. So David, I'm happy if you, or Dave, I'm happy if you want to respond. I don't.
Sure. Yeah, I'm pretty certain that question arose during Charlotte's talk, because yeah, that was a point that she made, and that's certainly, I think, in an animals in society, animal liberation setting, a difficult and sensitive topic, and so I do want to respect the indigenous cosmologies and traditional practices out of which that framework and that practice comes from. I think for me, yeah, when I think about relations between folks like me, settlers in the settler colony, and indigenous peoples, I'm reminded by people like Charlotte, by people like Lisa Kimmerer, Robin Wall Kimmerer, people like Leanne Bettasamnakas Simpson, people like who else? Tons of people, even Arturo Escobar, Denise Martinez, and others who have talked about the importance of consent between different peoples and just in consent between humans and the land and non-human relatives, and how difficult that is to conceptualize and to operationalize that and to practice that, particularly in Western context. For me, the other issue, and certainly this was brought up earlier, I think by Charlotte, was reciprocity. And for me, that's maybe a more helpful way to think about this. And for me, I think I translate that to think about the scale of the taking, the scale of this relationship. And so, generally speaking, I think it is safe to say that what we find historically and even today in terms of indigenous peoples' relationship to non-human animals and consumption and death of those non-human animal relatives is that it pales by comparison to the industrial scale that we have seen as associated with capitalism. And so that's a difficult conversation because, of course, in an animals and society and animal liberation context, I don't want to make that error of just being the ecologist and say, oh, this is about the scale of population, and we need to respect the sanctity and the integrity of each individual non-human. But I guess I would say that this is a conversation that is really complicated and sensitive, and I don't think there are any easy answers. So, Lisa Jean, I don't know if you wanted to jump into the fray.
No, I mean, I think what you said is really good and important. I mean, my experience is that I wrote another book on horseshoe crabs, and there's a lot that goes on in the pharmaceutical industry claiming that horseshoe crabs are giving their blood as a donation, and that there's a very slippery language of consent, and that animals giving themselves over, or honeybees. I've also written about honeybees and honeybees giving their honey or their pollen or their pollination services. And I think that this is a very slippery term that's often used by institutional actors to encourage us to feel that this is all a very easy exchange that has very limited effects on the animals, which we know not to be true. But if we use sanitizing language, it sort of gives us permission and encourages us to go along with that. So that's the only thing I would say.
Thank you. Are you ready for more questions? Okay. I was trying to think of a way to loop these together in one smooth flow, but I'm not sure. So I'm going to just hop over to one that Ken asked, which is and I think this might be a question for Dave. Why did the animal protection movement and field focus on suffering rather than death, hence promoting the corrective illustrated in this anthology? Or maybe you might all have something to say on that, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, I think it's an important question, and I guess I'm wondering if that question arose from the way I was framing the issue. Obviously the book, the primary focus of the book is on death, and I guess for me, it's hard to separate that out from suffering. And of course, Lisa Jean's excellent work on suffering and the way the temporal aspect of that slow violence is extremely important. So I'm not sure that I would say that there has been that imbalance. I think Katja, you could speak to that as well. And I say that also just because in so many of the circles and networks I'm in, people have been focused on maybe both or all of the above. So I may be misunderstanding the question, but I'm happy for other folks want to jump in, and maybe I'll have a more coherent response.
I mean, I would just quickly say that I think what's interesting about that question is in my own work, I see that death is maybe at the end of a long experience of death, right? Like death is the moment that you stop living, but that death has been happening really over time, incrementally. And maybe the animal protection movement, if it is a monolith or it can be identified as a thing, which I'm not sure. I'm not an expert in that. So like maybe Katja knows more. I think that different coalitions of movements around animal rights and animal liberation have focused on animal suffering because they want the intervention to happen while the animals are still alive, and they are seeing the suffering in real time. And that the death, maybe at that point you feel like you sort of lost the war. I mean, I'm just thinking of like like even the work of oncologists, like they're fighting cancer while it's happening. So like I just think around social movements, how social movements are organized. Often it's around the actual activity of the injustice going on. But again, this is not my field. Katja, do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and I was thinking about it, Dave, as you were talking and reflecting on the fact that in the circles that you're part of, you're not sure that you observe, greater attention to suffering than to death, because a lot of my own scholarship has focused particularly on companion animal welfare. In that domain, death is often the primary focus, and it's the people who are concerned about suffering who often feel like their efforts at having people pay attention to how much animals in animal shelters, for example, or in puppy mills suffer doesn't get enough attention because everybody's just focusing on animals who've died, or at risk of being killed. And so I wonder too if there aren't some interesting variations across sort of different parts of the animal protection and animal liberation movements, where some may be more focused on suffering than on death, and others, the other way around. I'm also thinking sort of from a connection perspective. I know that my personal first exposure as a tween to the animal liberation movement was through PETA style films that showed rabbits in laboratories and calves and veal farms and so forth. And I think that perhaps in terms of what we see publicly, that the animal protection movement puts forward a lot of visuals about suffering, because that's where they hope to tap into human empathy. Right. Whereas seeing a dead body, seeing a corpse, particularly one that's maybe already been partially or totally dismembered for consumptive purposes, right, isn't going to evoke that same kind of emotional response. So there may be something, quite strategic, just in the public facing work of animal protection that emphasizes suffering.
We just got a question in the chat that I think sort of builds on what you're saying. The question is, do you think society generally values the death of animals that are companion animals? Which I heard a little bit of that in what you were saying. So do they value those deaths more than animals who are used as food? I'm guessing you're all going to say yes, but I'm willing to let you surprise me. But the following for that is, why do you think that is? What mechanisms is that working through?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would answer like about the affective relationship. Like if you have an affective relationship in real time with an animal, that you've been socialized to think of as a member of the family, et cetera, versus animals that most of us, not all of us, don't have the capacity to be close to farm animals or other animals. And their deaths are so normalized as part of our everyday lives that um, like I think part of the question is which lives are grievable, to kind of misquote Judith Butler. Like some lives are grievable lives and some lives are not grievable lives. And we have that within humans in the stratification system of which lives. And someone put in the chat around necropolitics, like who's let to live and who's allowed to die or who's let to die. And so these stratifications and hierarchies around death exist not only among humans, but also among non-human animals in the kind of selective speciesism within which we decide what animal is going to rank above other animals. So I think part of it has to do with our proximity to those animals. Part of it has to do with our socialization. Part of it has to do with the hegemonic idea of a companion animal and even a maybe performativity around suffering and grievability as showing your moral character of really loving animals. I mean, I'm teaching a critical animal studies class this semester, and I had the first class yesterday, and I asked the students when they were introducing themselves to say one positive thing about themselves. And a lot of my students said, I love my cat, and I love my dog, and they're a member of my family. And I didn't prompt them. They could have said, I love making lasagna. I mean, it just was a thing that I think they wanted to signal, like maybe not virtue signaling exactly, but they wanted to signal something about why they were in this class and their love for dogs and cats. And it is, I think, very consistent. And it's also a way to connect to other humans. Like they're not doing anything bad by doing that. They're trying to be social in a context. But, no one said I love cockroaches. Like it is very charismatic megafauna, very vertebrate species, mammal, social mammal, heavy. Those types of animals are way more grievable than, horseshoe crabs and cockroaches, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, I think those are great points. I agree with all that. I would say just maybe briefly that I think if we're talking about pets, non-human animals as pets versus non-human animals for other purposes in industrial agriculture and capitalism more broadly, I think for pets, the death is registered as a loss. And I think for the other animals, it is registered as a gain for the system. So it is valued, but in different ways. So that death for the industrial capitalist system is absolutely necessary to fuel and provide energy for that system. Ethically, though, these are not seen, as beings with, worthy of ethical consideration. So I think it's valued in different ways.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I saw someone put into the chat a comment that I think was in response to this question, that this is also about speciesism, and part of speciesism is also the species hierarchy, right? That we as humans value animals that we perceive to be more like us in some way, right? To be more intelligent, to be better able to communicate with us, more so than animals who we see as markedly different. And we also have our own constructed ideas about who's cute and who's not, etc. So, the killing of Harambe the gorilla in the Cincinnati Zoo a number of years ago was a source of national outrage. But I know, as someone who's intimately familiar with zoos, is that they're killing animals on a routine basis that nobody is paying attention to, typically so-called prey animals, right, or other smaller animals where they just have a surplus of them. So, they kill them and feed them to other animals, or do other things with them because they're considered to be, in excess. And I'll just throw out, I appreciate, Lisa Jean, that you mentioned cockroaches. I just recently, over the holiday break, finally got around to reading Ben Goldfarb's book, Crossings, how road ecology is shaping the future of our planet. And we have a chapter in When Animals Die specifically focused on roadkill, which is, after industrial agriculture, the leading cause of death to animals globally. But one that is, infrequently spoken about. And the most common victims of roadkill are insects, right? And they are almost never a subject of discussion unless there's something very special or spectacular about them, like they play a big role in the ecosystem, like Lisa Jean's bees. Or here in California, everyone runs out and tries to buy milkweed to attract monarch butterflies into our yards during their migration. So there's like a few charismatic insect species, but by and large, as part of the species hierarchy, right, they're not considered at all.
Okay, so now we're coming up with just 10 minutes left. So here is something that I would like to do. I have a question for you, Katja, and I would like, while you are answering that, for Dave and Lisa Jean, we have about 5 open questions. And from hearing the two of you talk, I think you might each gravitate towards different ones. So I was going to let you all look at the Q&A forum and see if there's one that you really want to answer after Katja answers my question, which is going to be kind of a doozy. So as the editor of the volume, you are most intimately familiar with most of the chapters. So even those of us who have started to read the book haven't gotten through them all, probably not even the people published in it. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, as you put the book together, were there any overarching themes that you were really trying to have the audience sort of see collectively when they, read this whole anthology? Or were there any themes about death that, as you were putting it together, like things that you saw in multiple chapters that really stuck out to you when we're thinking about animal death?
Mhm. Yeah, thanks for that question, Carol. So this is a co-edited volume with Julian Keenan, and Julian is a faculty member in psychology who has more of a neuroscience orientation and what might be considered, a hard sciences kind of background. Whereas I'm a sociologist housed in a critical interdisciplinary feminist department, and so don't have that similar type of background. And so I think that we both came to the volume bringing in overlapping, but in some ways a little bit distinct kind of interests in the key themes. Overarchingly, we were interested in having contributions that were going to explore how humans make sense of animal death, and we were particularly interested in thinking about different types of structural and ideological mechanisms at work that continue to support the high volume at which humans engage in killing and consuming dead animals, right? Whether it's meat products or other types of products. So both of us were definitely coming to the volume with that kind of critical perspective as folks committed to improving the life chances and the life opportunities for animals. I also have a particular interest in exploring all aspects of animal studies from feminist and race critical perspectives, and I think that there is a strong theme across multiple chapters. We have contributors who are approaching the topic of animal death, integrating one or more of sort of what we would consider like critical perspectives, whether it's Marxist, whether it's anti-racist, feminist, some combination of those as well. And in that respect, we were really thinking about work that would illuminate how the life chances and life experiences of marginalized and oppressed human groups are tied up in the experiences of animals. I think David, of our participants today, has articulated that most clearly as part of his work. I think Charlotte's work, also very much draws attention to that in terms of the immense struggle that Indigenous peoples have had in trying to maintain sovereignty over their land and the resources within it. And then finally, I guess I would just add, I don't want to take up too much time because I see the clock ticking, sorry, that we were interested also in encouraging contributors to think about resistance, what here could change, right? When you talk about animal death and think about animal death, I certainly experience it as overwhelming. Like there's no way to even quantify how many animals are killed at any given moment. Scientists cannot agree on how many animals have already been rendered extinct, how many are being rendered extinct, on a weekly or even daily basis. We don't even know how many species there are. There's a lot about this that can be overwhelming. So how do we work through and around that overwhelm to develop and foster empathy, to integrate our commitment to animal liberation with our commitments to what Dave in his work calls total liberation, right? Liberation for oppressed and marginalized persons, right? To a radical revisioning, perhaps. That may not be what every contributor endorses, but perhaps a radical revisioning of our whole system of social organization.
Thank you. Dave and Lisa Jean, is one of you excited to answer one of these questions? They're really great questions on there. So Lisa Jean, you're unmuted. So
Well, I
I'll
think
let you
one
go.
of them relates a little bit to what Dave was saying before. I think the genocide question and the animalization of human beings to justify. So like this relates to something you were saying before. So I thought maybe we could talk about that, but I would love you to start first because I think it relates also much more to your current or your long-going research project.
Yeah, so that the audience who might not be seeing the Q&A, There's a question, would anyone like to speak to the animalization of humans to legitimize genocide? And that there's also a question about the attitude towards the Palestinian genocide. So there's a comment directly talking about that as well. So for those of you who didn't see that, that's the context. So I'll hand it over to you now, Dave.
Oh, sure. Yeah, thanks so much for this bold question. Yeah, I mean, after the Hamas attack on Israel in October 2023, Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu stated publicly, quote, "You must remember what Amalek has done to you, says our holy Bible," end quote. So according to the Bible, the Amalekites, of course, launched a surprise attack on the Jewish people in ancient times, if you know your Bible, and the biblical passage encourages Israelites to take revenge. There's a professor, Mahdi and Bari, a professor of religion at University of North Carolina, who was quoted as saying, "The biblical commandment is to completely destroy all of Amalek." And when I'm talking about completely destroy, we're talking about killing each and every one of them, including babies, including their property, and including the animals. Everything, end quote. So for me, this kind of language reveals the awful truth about war and genocide, that mass violence always impacts both humans and our non-human relatives. This war has destroyed countless human and non-human lives. The entire war, the conflict, the occupation is also, of course, shaped by the long-standing marginalization and animalization of Jews and Palestinians. And so I'm convinced that we will never address the Palestinian-Israeli struggle fully if we aren't including an animal studies perspective.
Lisa Jean, we are coming up at time, so I'll let you answer the question. So anyone who's in the audience, we are going to go till the end of this question, so probably 2 or 3 minutes over, just to let you know, so we understand if you have to leave early. But Lisa Jean, I'd like you to have a chance to answer the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just say that in countless human wars and religious conflicts, humans have been likened to animals to justify whatever happens to them. And so I think understanding speciesism, as Dave has said, is critical to understanding what we end up how we end up justifying atrocious things that we do to other people. And it begins with how we make the first distinction between ourselves, which are animals, but we say non-human animals. So we teach that distinction and classification system in order to produce hierarchical thinking. And then in so doing, we can then treat other beings as is at our leisure, what we want to do. Katja, I want to give you a chance to answer too, since you're here, and I want to give you the last word, since you organized this whole thing and did all this labor to bring us together and edited our work so beautifully.
Well, thank you. I think I would just echo what you and Dave have already shared, that this, the animalization of humans in conflict is something that we see all too often. It's happening right now in the United States, right, with our current new president has routinely compared various groups of people to various different types of animals. Right, this is a very effective way of trying to denigrate a population of people. In When Animals Die, we have a chapter by Bénédicte Boisseron, who specifically and in more detail engages exactly with this question, looking at the linking of Blackness with animality in U.S. history, as she has also explored in her book Afrodog. So it's another tool, another mechanism to justify both harm and exploitation towards people, right? Certain people, specific people, and towards animals.
Thank you all so much. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. There's fabulous questions being asked, and I think this could have been longer, but I know that all of you in the audience probably have other meetings to go to, probably on Zoom, maybe classes. So we'll wrap it up. We didn't get a chance to do a full introduction of all the speakers. So after each of these events, I send an email out when the recording is ready to anyone who registered, because I know a lot of people can't make it at the exact time. And so they still want to see this. When I send that out, I will send links to all of our speakers today and their bios, as well as a link to where you can get this volume. Thank you everyone who came today. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. This was a really great conversation. I really enjoyed it. And the audience, you are all really engaged, and I loved the questions. And again, we're sorry we couldn't get to all of them. We'll have another one of these colloquiums next month. We are sorry we don't yet have the time and date. But if I have that by the time I email you a recording of this, I'll be sure to pop it in that email. So thank you, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.